Добрий день, я Андрій Петрович Wilson. Наскільки тато був Петро. Дякую за увагу і за ваші переклади. Дякую Антону за його допомогу в створенні цього курсу. Вірю в перемогу України. Слава Україні! Hello everybody, welcome to the final lecture in the series Russia's War Against Ukraine. Lecture 8, Wartime Ukraine, in which we'll try and bring together all of the themes that we've talked about in previous lectures. Russia as empire, Russia and political technology. Is Russia fascist? And with respect to Ukraine, the ideal of liberty and democracy as opposed to the sometimes or often imperfect realities of political practice in Ukraine, at least before invasion on February 24th. Russia clearly expected quick victory in February 2022. Previously, it had aimed at what it called the federalization of Ukraine, which it really meant the confederalization. The creation of Ukraine as a kind of second Bosnia, an extremely loose tripartite arrangement in which the pro-Russian part would be almost de facto independent, much like the Republika Srpska in Bosnia. Clearly this time, however, the aim was all of Ukraine, albeit ill thought out. Russia expected victory within days, capture of Kiev, and the flight of Zelensky and his government, to be replaced by Russian agents of influence in a kind of political operation, presumably like the Crimean coup in the spring of 2014, when the Crimean parliament was taken over by Russian troops and the government changed and a referendum announced, basically at gunpoint. So we can presume that the plan was to do the same in Kiev. Even with unpopular politicians, you can do it at gunpoint. You can do it if, and this is proven, you have elements within the judiciary at the very, very top who were prepared to legalize those kind of changes. We know that Russia had a big fund for buying influence within Ukraine. According to various sources, 5 billion within the key departments of Russian foreign intelligence, the FSB. 5 billion controlled by this guy, Sergei Beseda, and his deputy, Vladimir Petrovsky. A lot of that money disappeared. The other picture here shows some of the property owned by the Beseda family. Very nice, very extensive. Court documents for Viktor Medvedchuk, who we talked about a lot in the last lecture. He was arrested in the aftermath of a Russian invasion. In the legal case against him in court in Lviv, $1 billion had been channeled through him from Moscow. That's a lot of money. A lot of it was stolen. Not all of it was effectively spent. And a lot of it was delusional. The idea that Medvedchuk would somehow be president would have to have overridden his local non-popularity. The people that Russia relied on were often refugees from the Yanukovych era in Russia, remote and prone to wishful thinking in Russia. Russians cooperated with this guy, another political technologist, Mikhail Pogrebinsky. He was responsible for opinion polling within Ukraine, which Putin, quoted, relied on. When the police searched his flat, they found one poll that was reported back to Putin. 44% of Ukrainians supported Putin. It's extremely unlikely, basically not true. So the process of reporting back to Putin was a kind of Potemkin process involving political technologists assembling stories that they thought the president wanted to hear. Other agents of influence turned out to be much weaker than Russia thought. The Russian church in Ukraine, and here you see its leader Onufry next to Patriarch Kirill, claimed to be the biggest church in Ukraine, but life for it has been extremely difficult since the invasion. Support has dropped from about a quarter of the population to about 4%. The church has had to declare independence, although not proper, full autocephaly. And since December, legal processes against it have seen it losing many of its key churches, like this beautiful Cathedral of the Assumption in Kiev. Its long-term future is in doubt. Many of Russia's agents of influence turned out to be ineffective. Medvedchuk ended up arrested. Other agents of influence have gradually been exposed. 15 MPs are missing or fled. Security Services of Ukraine claims 600 in total have been exposed. A lot of them were like Tatiana Tomilina, a failed politician in Kherson who took over the Russian administration during the occupation. So the assumptions of a short war no longer apply. The mix between war and subversion is now much more towards war. But subversion and political technology is still there. Political technology, propaganda, will be hugely important in kind of history back to front. Whatever territory Russia may end up occupying can be justified as historically Russian. I make that safe prediction. Whatever land Russia tries to hold on to, it will claim that this is historically Russia. Another problem with long-term war is partial mobilization that Russia announced in September. Russia's political technology state is not a mobilizational state. People are supposed to support the propaganda line, whatever it is, largely passively. So Russia has problems with general mass mobilization. In the areas that it occupied, this is an economic plan to take over all of the heavy industry in South and East Ukraine. Is Russia an empire? Yes. Remember we talked about it not seeing Ukraine. Look at this long list of renamings in occupied territories, restoring Imperial Russian, Soviet, Russian Orthodox names, and getting rid of Ukrainian cultural difference. In the occupied areas, Ukrainian culture was elided and Russian culture, Imperial culture, put in its place. Kherson is a town with Russian history, screams this poster, because Pushkin once visited it. There he is. Russia is here forever. Kherson forever with Russia. Read those posters. We also asked the question of whether Russia was fascist. It is certainly conducting a war crime. Mass killings, torture, deportations, including of children, targeting of civilian areas, re-education, targeting of the Crimean Tatars for forced mobilization. Huge number of websites are devoted to cataloguing Russian war crime. By the time of this lecture, 71,918 cases have been documented. But already the General Prosecutor's Office has a higher number, 72,189 in this screenshot from the next day, actually. This project shows exactly where war crime has been, obviously in the occupied areas. And it shows the kind of timeline of incidents very much concentrated in March and April when Russia was retreating. This website shows the type of cultural war crime that Russia has engaged in. It shows how widespread attacks on monuments, places of worship and burial, that's the kind of colour coding in the top right there. And that's a kind of screenshot of just how numerous cases of attacks on Ukrainian culture, monuments, churches, museums have been throughout Ukraine. All of which meets any definition of genocide. According to Raphael Lemkin, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aimed at the destruction of the essential foundations of the life of national groups. Not the killing of all members of a group, but significant numbers of it, and its cultural basis. On my reading then, this is genocide. Political change. Most obviously, Zelensky himself has been an extremely effective war leader, has been in many ways liberated from the kind of political problems that we talked about in the last lecture. Ukrainians' political elite used to symbolize everything that was wrong with Ukraine. Now you have Zelensky symbolizing everything that is right with Ukraine. Here he is addressing the UK Houses of Parliament. Here he is with his team, kind of collectively branded in the kind of Ukrainian sort of military/sport wear that Zelensky has turned into a brand. MTech is the company. Just one example of Zelensky as communicator-in-chief. When he addressed the UK Parliament, he quoted Winston Churchill so that we could recognise it. We shall fight them on the beaches. But he also Ukrainianised it. We shall fight in the woods, in the fields, on the beaches, in the cities and villages, in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall fight on the spoil tips, on the banks of Ukrainian rivers, the Kalmius and the Dnipro, and we shall not surrender. So both a much more constructive use of technology, or even political technology, if you want to call it that, for Zelensky, the great communicator. If he's communicator-in-chief, his commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, also does a little bit of PR. He has his own foundation, shown on the right here. Mi Pereможemo, we will be victorious. But he also has he and Zelensky have a pretty good division of labour. Compared to generals and politicians in other wars, Churchill and his generals, for example, in World War II, Zelensky does the communicating, Zaluzhny does the fighting. Ukraine was becoming a much more consolidated society already before 2022. Russia was guilty of assuming very little change, ignoring those consolidating factors. But now even more so. Instead of this paradigm of Ukraine as somehow divided, the kind of political technology divisions created by in many ways, Paul Manafort that we talked about in previous lecture. Ukraine is a consensus society with 80, 90% majorities. Zelensky's rating, 91% in one poll. 98% who believe in victory, which is as much a should as an is statement. 73% believe the country is heading in the right direction. 93% see a promising future, which is clearly not an economic statement or even a military one, but an existential one. We're doing the right thing by fighting. Ukraine, as a civic, political nation, is a real thing. Huge numbers involved in civil society, support for the war, donating funds, volunteer work, even more so than in previous years. Resolution. 86% saying it is necessary, either completely or on the whole, to continue armed resistance to Russian aggression, even if shelling of Ukrainian cities continues. Huge numbers opposed to any concession of any territory. This is in Ukrainian, but I've translated it. How certain are you that Ukraine will be able to repel the attack of Russia? Numbers going up, 56% opposed to 38% before the war, January. 95% to 3% now. How acceptable would you consider the following conditions for a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia? Huge numbers opposed to Russia keeping troops in occupied territories or keeping Crimea. This, I think, is most striking of all. This is an opinion poll in German done for the Munich Security Conference. Do you think that Ukraine should continue fighting or capitulate under the following circumstances? Continuous conventional bombing of Ukrainian cities. 95% say Ukraine should keep fighting. But incredibly, 89% say Ukraine should keep fighting, even after nuclear attack over the Black Sea on the battlefield, or even 89% if a Ukrainian city was attacked. Also a war of change. Zelensky in his annual address to Parliament in December said, "No one at the front will understand those who, having any political weight or any position of authority, will try to return to their old life before February the 24th. Right? We can't go back to things as they were." So many of the things that we talked about in the last lecture, there's already considerable change. Oligarchs, for example, have lost huge amounts of their fixed assets and wealth. Here's a list of how the fortunes of Ukraine's 12 richest have all gone down. Collectively, they've lost 20 billion, down to a mere 22.5. Just as importantly, the politics, the cycle of wealth defense that we talked about in the last lecture has been broken. Media in particular is now corralled into a kind of collective state monopoly called the United News Telemarathon, or Ukraine Together. Particularly oligarch TVs take turns. The day is divided up into slots for all of the previous independent media. But basically it's all within this general marathon. A so-called de-oligarchization law, or locally the Z-oligarchization law, has been used to force leading oligarchs to give up their media. Rinat Akhmetov, Petro Poroshenko. Many companies have been nationalized for national security reasons. Oil, gas, cars, trucks, reactors. Either because their bosses were agents of Russian influence or because their products were needed for the war economy. What will happen with political technology? Elections are due in Ukraine in 2024. They'll be incredibly difficult to organize, but 5 years from the elections in 2019, elections are due. 11 parties, pro-Russian or pro-peace parties, have been banned. Zelensky and his party have massive ratings, but new elections will mean new parties. Hopefully that would be a new circumstance. But one slight worry is that every political consultant in the world will probably want to work with Zelensky at the next elections. A possible warning for Ukraine's political future. Another is securitization. In April last year, Zelensky talked of Ukraine becoming a big Israel with our own face. There would be soldiers in cinemas, supermarkets, and people with weapons. He meant that Ukraine would have to be vigilant, even in a post-war situation. But there is a kind of general tendency towards the presidentialization of politics, obviously, but also the increasing power in wartime of the security services. Corruption. Again, you see a massive change in public opinion. A poll in August of last year, repeating the same questions as in 2021, saw big rises in those who said eradicating corruption should be one of the main post-war priorities, ahead even of rebuilding infrastructure or strengthening defence. Those who said corruption couldn't be justified went up from 40 to 64%, 2021 to 2022. People are more prepared to join collective protests and to make complaints against corrupt officials. So the post-war atmosphere will be very different. Ukraine has applied to join the EU. The 7 criteria that the EU has set are all related to the problems that we talked about last week in the legal system, with corruption, with the oligarchy. According to a perhaps rather mechanical assessment by a group of Ukrainian NGOs, Ukraine scores 5.8 out of 10, up from 4.4 a few months ago. So Ukraine, even in wartime, is making progress towards improving its political and its economic system. This, of course, is incredibly important because of the sheer amount of money that is necessary to rebuild the Ukrainian economy. Estimate starts at 750 billion plus. Big question is where that will come from. Hopefully from Russian assets, hopefully from Russian reparations. Some will come from international financial institutions, some will come from foreign direct investment, minimal amount hopefully from Western taxpayers. None of that will happen, however, unless all of the other problems are solved, unless Ukraine is physically safe, unless it has a secure peace, and unless it has a rule of law. Huge amounts need to change, and already are changing, in order for Ukraine to be able to build a new economy, rather than for the old oligarchy simply to be reborn and re-enriched. So for a country at war, Ukraine is actually doing a lot. 2022 is also the third in a series of reinventions of Ukraine since becoming independent in 1991. It's been independent for more than 30 years, but it's this cumulative reinvention that has changed Ukraine beyond recognition. Particularly because that process has been cumulative, particularly because each event has been a bigger magnitude than the last, and none more so than the current war. So the big question, can post-war Ukraine improve on pre-war Ukraine, can hopefully be answered yes. But stable peace also depends on what happens in Russia. And many of the problems that we talked about in weeks 1 to 4 are incredibly deep-rooted. Russia will not abandon its imperial behaviour, its fascist-like behaviour, unless the root problem of its political system, its political technology, and its propaganda state is also dismantled. Otherwise, a revanchist Russia will always threaten a peaceful post-war Ukraine. Thank you for listening to the lectures, Russia's War Against Ukraine, either in whole or in part. If you got all the way through all 8 lectures, thank you. But each individual lecture should be comprehensible on its own if you want to jump from one to the other, as you wish. I've also been attentive to your comments online, so please do add more, likes, dislikes, shares, and I'll answer any questions that you are happy to post. Thank you for listening.